The bitter Montana winter howled across Redemption Valley like the devil's own breath, the frozen ground cracking under the weight of a cold that hadn't lifted in 4 long months. But Catherine Blackwell had endured harsher winters than this, winters of the land and winters of the soul. At 53, she had buried more than most, her husband, her dreams of justice, and a past so drenched in blood that few would believe the quiet homesteader had once been the architect of so much necessary violence. All that remained was her. Weathered claim nestled against the Bitterroot Mountains, a cabin built by her own hands, and Titan, her prized bison bull, the last living reminder of the herd that once represented her hope for the future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Titan wasn't just livestock. He was Catherine's final chance to rebuild after a winter that had claimed every other animal on her struggling homestead. With spring planting still months away, the massive beast represented her only chance of survival against the crushing poverty that stalked the Montana territory like another predator. The riders who approached her property that frigid February morning thought they'd found easy pickings. A solitary widow, alone and vulnerable, the kind of victim the lawless frontier created and discarded with each shifting border. What they couldn't know, what no one in Redemption Valley could possibly suspect, was that before she was Catherine Blackwell, grieving widow and struggling homesteader, she had been the Verdict, leader of the most feared bounty-hunting operation ever to bring law to the untamed West. And these men were about to awaken a hunter who had been dormant, but never truly tamed. The relentless wind had just begun to shift direction when Catherine spotted the trio of riders cresting the eastern ridge. She paused at her chopping block, the axe suspended mid-swing as she studied their approach through narrowed eyes. 20 years of frontier living hadn't dulled her instincts. Travelers in February with no supply wagon and moving with such purpose rarely brought good tidings. "Titan," she called softly, watching the massive bison lift his shaggy head from where he pawed through snow for the hay she'd scattered earlier. The beast regarded her with ancient, knowing eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than most men she'd encountered. At nearly 2,000 pounds, his frame dominated the small paddock beside her cabin, steam rising from his nostrils in the bitter cold. Catherine set down her axe and reached instead for the Winchester rifle that leaned against the cabin wall. The weapon was worn, but meticulously maintained. Like everything else in her carefully ordered world, she didn't chamber around, not yet, but the familiar weight of the rifle brought a certain comfort as the riders drew closer. They were still, a quarter-mile out, but Catherine could read their approach like a book. 3 men, spread slightly apart, horses moving with the easy confidence of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Their clothing marked them as outsiders, too well equipped for drifters, too mismatched for military. Hired guns, most. Likely or perhaps opportunists drawn by rumors of abandoned homesteads after the brutal winter had forced many families eastward. Catherine's jaw tightened. The snows had indeed been merciless this season. Game had grown scarce, and supplies scarcer still in the isolated valley. The local marshal's office in Promise Creek was 15 miles away, might as well be 100 in these conditions. Remote homesteads like hers had been left to fend for themselves, a reality the approaching riders were clearly counting on. She moved Titan toward the barn with soft whistles and gentle gestures. The massive bison knew her commands as well as any trained horse, a bond forged through years of mutual survival. The beast could handle himself against wolves and mountain lions, had done so on multiple occasions, but men with firearms were a different sort of predator altogether. "Inside now, old friend," she murmured, securing the barn door once the bison lumbered through. "Let's see what business these gentlemen think they have with us." Catherine positioned herself on her cabin porch, rifle held casually but visibly across her body. Her graying auburn hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her tall frame straight, despite the years of hard work that had left their mark on her weathered hands and lined face. She wore practical clothes, wool trousers beneath a long skirt, layers of flannel and leather against the cold, a far cry from the distinctive black duster and silver-trimmed vest that had once been her trademark in another life. The lead rider pulled up 20 yards from her porch, snow billowing around his chestnut gelding. He was a tall man with a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes, partially hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality. This was no desperate homesteader turned. "Bandit, afternoon, ma'am," he called, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Mighty cold day to be out chopping wood alone." Catherine stood impassive, her rifle steady. "State your business. Sun's dropping fast and I've chores to finish before dark." The man smiled, revealing teeth too perfect for a frontiersman. "Names: Maxwell, James Maxwell. My associates and I are traveling through, securing provisions for our employer's interests north of here." "Town's 20 miles west," Catherine replied evenly. "General store should have what you need, though prices have doubled since the pass closed." One of the other riders, a heavy-set man with a face marked by old burns, spat into the snow. "We ain't looking for no general store goods, woman." Maxwell shot him a warning glance before turning back to Catherine with a practiced smile. "What my colleague means is that we're interested in more specialized items. I couldn't help but notice you're keeping a bison bull. Unusual livestock for a homestead." Catherine's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her rifle. "Titan's not livestock. He's not for sale." $500 is fair," Maxwell continued, as if she hadn't spoken, reaching inside his coat to produce a leather wallet. "More than fair, considering the difficulties of maintaining such a beast through winter." "As I said, he's not for sale at any price," Catherine replied, her voice cooling further. "Now I'll thank you for moving along before the light fails completely. Night comes quick in these mountains, and the trails aren't forgiving to those unfamiliar with them." The atmosphere shifted, subtle as a snake preparing to strike. Maxwell's friendly demeanor hardened, his eyes calculating. "Perhaps I'm not making myself clear, Mrs. Blackwell," Catherine supplied, her voice steady as stone. "Catherine Blackwell. Mrs. Blackwell." Maxwell's smile vanished entirely. "My associates, and I will be taking that bison. The only choice before you is whether you accept payment and live to rebuild come spring, or—" He let the threat hang in the air between them. 20 years ago, Catherine would have already put a bullet through Maxwell's eye for such insolence. The verdict had never been one to issue warnings, only sentences. But 2 decades of solitude had taught her restraint, if not submission. 3 men against 1 woman for a single bison, she observed, her tone deceptively mild. "Your mothers must be mighty proud." The burn-scarred man laughed harshly. "Hear that, boys? The widow's got sand." The third rider, younger than the others with a nervous energy about him, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Mr. Maxwell, maybe we should move on. Plenty of unguarded herds north of here once the weather breaks." "Quiet, Parker," Maxwell snapped before turning his attention back to Catherine. "Last chance, Mrs. Blackwell. $500 for the bison, and we'll leave you in peace." Catherine met his gaze unflinchingly. "You're not taking Titan. Not for 500, not for 5,000. Maxwell sighed as if genuinely disappointed. "Have it your way." He nodded to the burn-scarred man. "Ridley, secure the animal." Catherine raised her rifle, sighting down the barrel with practiced ease. "Take 1 step toward my barn, and I'll put you in the ground." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Maxwell laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "You really think you can take all 3 of us, Mrs. Blackwell? Be reasonable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "Don't need to take all three," Catherine replied calmly. "Just you, Mr. Maxwell. Rest of these boys strike me as followers, not leaders. Without you, they'll scatter like quail in a lightning storm." Something in her voice, the absolute certainty, the lack of fear or hesitation, made Maxwell study her more carefully. For 20 years, Catherine had worked to bury the verdict beneath layers of respectability and routine, but in moments of danger, something of the old hunter still showed in her eyes. Whatever Maxwell saw made him hesitate, but only briefly. His pride wouldn't allow him to back down before his men. With deliberate slowness, he shifted his coat aside to reveal a holstered Colt. "Last warning, widow. Stand aside." The crack of Catherine's Winchester split the winter air. Maxwell's hat flew from his head, a neat hole punched through its crown. His horse reared in panic, nearly unseating him. "That was your last warning," Catherine stated flatly. "Next one goes through your skull." The young rider, Parker, had drawn his pistol reflexively, but looked more terrified than threatening. The burn-scarred Ridley froze, reassessing the situation. "She's bluffing," he hissed. "She can't reload that rifle before we cut her down." What he couldn't see from his position was the Navy Colt partially hidden by Catherine's skirts, ready for her right hand the moment the rifle served its purpose. Maxwell, however, sensed the shifting odds. He'd expected easy prey and found a Wolverine instead. "We'll be moving on, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "But these parts can be dangerous for a woman alone. Accidents happen. Fires start. Would be a shame if you're still on my property in 10 seconds, Mr. Maxwell," Catherine interrupted. "The coyotes will be picking your bones clean by morning." Her voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to giving life or death. Commands. It was a tone that had once made the most hardened outlaws surrender their weapons without a fight, a voice that had directed operations across 3 territories when justice wore her face. 1. Maxwell's face contorted with fury. 2. "Let's go, boys," he finally ordered, wheeling his horse around. "The beast ain't worth the trouble." Catherine continued counting steadily as they rode away, her rifle trained on Maxwell's back until they disappeared over the ridge. Only when their silhouettes had vanished against the darkening sky did she lower her weapon, her hands betraying the slightest tremor, not from fear but from the effort of restraint. 20 years ago, she would have killed Maxwell without hesitation and hunted down his companions one by one across the territory. 20 years of trying to be something else, someone else, had changed her, but perhaps not as much as she'd believed. Catherine checked on Titan, stroking the Bison's massive head as he snorted at her through the barn door. "They'll be back," she murmured, feeling the coarse fur beneath her fingertips. "And not just for you." In the fading light, she secured the barn and returned to her cabin. The temperature was dropping rapidly with the sun, the familiar creaking of the cabin's timbers under extreme cold, a reminder of her vulnerability. Catherine moved methodically through her evening routine, banking the fire, checking the water barrel, securing the shutters against the night wind. From beneath the loose floorboard under her bed, she retrieved a weathered cedar box. Inside lay mementos of another life, a silver-plated Colt with intricate engravings along the barrel, newspaper clippings from as far away as Chicago detailing the exploits of a notorious bounty-hunting operation, and a faded tintype of a much younger Catherine surrounded by hard-eyed men and women, her expression stern and commanding. Catherine ran her fingers over the image. She had been 32 then, at the height of her power, when the name The Verdict sent outlaws fleeing across state lines, before Joshua, before redemption. Before she'd buried that life beneath the quiet existence of Catherine Blackwell, respectable widow, she set aside the old photograph and lifted the silver Colt, checking its action with practiced hands. The weapon had been ceremonially presented to her after the Blackwater Gang operation. 7 outlaws brought to justice after a 3-month hunt across 2 territories. The inscription along the barrel read simply, "Justice rendered." Catherine returned the box to its hiding place, but kept the engraved Colt. Some ghosts couldn't stay buried forever. As expected, they came that night. Not for Titan this time, but for retribution. Catherine was waiting. The moment she'd seen Maxwell's eyes, she'd known his type. A man whose pride wouldn't allow a woman to best him, especially publicly before his men. He would return, and he would intend to make an example of her. The moon was 3/4 full, casting blue-white light across the snow-covered yard as 2 riders approached from the west, using the tree line to muffle their approach. Catherine watched from the darkened window of her cabin, noting that only 2 had returned, Maxwell and the burn-scarred Ridley. The younger man, Parker, was notably absent, perhaps having found his conscience, or perhaps deemed unnecessary for what Maxwell planned. They dismounted 100 yards out, leaving their horses ground-tied among the pines. A mistake in Catherine's view. In this cold, any horse might spook at a sudden sound, leaving them stranded miles from anywhere. Catherine weighed her options. She could wait in the cabin, where the log walls offered some protection but also limited her mobility and sight lines, or she could meet them on the ground of her choosing. The verdict would never have hidden behind walls. She slipped out the back door, moving silently across the packed snow of her yard to the shadows of the woodshed. 20 years of honest living might have softened her body, but the harsh terrain of Montana Territory had kept her tough. Her footfalls made less noise than a hunting fox as she circled wide, positioning herself behind the approaching men. "Burn it all," Maxwell was saying in a harsh whisper. "The barn first, then the cabin. Let her try to run, and we'll put her down like the she-wolf she thinks she is." Ridley chuckled, the sound ugly in the still night air. "Shame to waste such an opportunity, boss. Woman like that living alone all this time. Might be worth having some fun before—" "Shut your mouth, Ridley," Maxwell cut him off. "We're here for justice, not your perversions." Justice. Catherine nearly laughed at the irony. Men like Maxwell always clothed their wounded pride in nobler terms. She waited until they separated, Maxwell heading for the cabin while Ridley moved toward the barn with a coal oil lantern. The moment they were sufficiently distant from each other, she made her move. Ridley heard her a second too late. By the time he turned, Catherine had already pressed the muzzle of her silver Colt against the base of his skull. "Drop the lantern," she whispered. "Gently." He hesitated and she pressed harder. "Drop it or join your ancestors." The lantern settled softly onto the snow. Catherine relieved him of his gun with practiced efficiency. "Walk to the water trough. Hands where I can see them." Once there, she brought the butt of her revolver down on the base of his skull, hard enough to render him unconscious, but measured to avoid killing him. The verdict would have slit his throat without hesitation, but Catherine Blackwell had made promises to Joshua, to herself, to God. One down, one remaining. A floorboard creaked in the cabin. Maxwell was already inside. Catherine made a split-second decision. The barn and Titan could be rebuilt. Her own life, once taken, was gone forever. She changed course, moving swiftly and silently toward her home. Through the window, she could make out Maxwell's silhouette as he moved through her darkened living room, pistol drawn, searching for her. She considered shooting him through the glass, but dismissed the thought. Too easy for him to hear the approach, too hard to ensure a kill shot through the distorting pain. Instead, she circled to the back door she'd left slightly ajar. Maxwell was now in her bedroom, rifling through her possessions, likely seeking valuables to steal after he'd finished his justice. Catherine waited, still as death, until he emerged from the bedroom. Then she stepped into the doorway, her silver colt leveled at his chest. "Looking for me, Mr. Maxwell?" He froze, then slowly raised his hands, his own pistol still clutched in. His right. "Mrs. Blackwell, seems we both misjudged the situation. Put the gun down now. Let's be reasonable. There's nothing reasonable about men who threaten a widow and plan to burn her home," Catherine replied, her voice as hard as the Montana bedrock. "Put the gun down." Maxwell's eyes darted past her, and a slow smile spread across his face. "I don't think I will." Too late, Catherine sensed movement behind her. Something heavy struck her shoulder, not a bullet, but the solid weight of a gun barrel. She staggered forward, maintaining her grip on her weapon but momentarily disoriented. Ridley stood in the doorway, blood trickling from the wound on his head, his damaged face twisted in triumph. "Got her, boss." Catherine recovered quickly, decades of survival instinct surging to the fore. She dropped to one knee, bringing her Colt up, but Maxwell was already advancing, his own weapon now aimed squarely at her face. That was quite a performance earlier. "And today, Mrs. Blackwell," he said with genuine appreciation, "you had me fooled, but no lone woman gets the better of James Maxwell twice." Catherine's mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles, assessing threats. Two armed men, both with guns drawn, both with clear shots. Joshua would understand if she broke her vow tonight. Sometimes survival requires blood. "You know," Maxwell continued conversationally, "there's something familiar about you, the way you handle yourself, the way you move." He studied her face, in the dim light filtering through the windows. "What did you say your name was again?" "Catherine Blackwell," she answered, watching for any distraction, any opening. "Blackwell," he repeated thoughtfully. "Married to that ranger who died last winter, Joshua Blackwell?" Catherine's silence was confirmation enough. "Funny thing," Maxwell mused. "Knew Joshua Blackwell years back. Territorial ranger, disappeared during a manhunt north of the Snake River. Everyone thought he was dead until he resurfaced years later, retired to a quiet life of ranching." His eyes narrowed. Imagine that! The implications hung in the air between them. If Maxwell knew Joshua had been a ranger, he might well know other details, including who Joshua had been hunting when he disappeared. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Mr. Maxwell," Catherine asked, playing for time as she assessed her dwindling options. "I'm suggesting, Mrs. Blackwell, that perhaps your husband brought back more than just himself from that manhunt." Maxwell's smile widened. "I've heard stories about a woman they called the Verdict, led the most effective bounty hunting operation the territories had ever seen. 24 men under her command. Brought in more than 60 outlaws, dead or alive. Rangers, marshals, Pinkertons, all failed to recruit her." Catherine kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. No one in Redemption Valley knew that history. She and Joshua had been careful, starting fresh where no one knew their pasts. "Interesting story," she replied evenly. "What happened?" "To this Verdict vanished," Maxwell said. "About the same time Ranger Blackwell reappeared." He studied her face intently. "Some say he killed her. Others say—" He paused. "Others say she was clever enough to realize the frontier was closing, that proper law was coming, that perhaps she'd earned enough to disappear. Start fresh." Ridley shifted impatiently. "What's this got to do with anything, boss? Let's just finish her and take the Bison." "Patience, Ridley," Maxwell chided, never taking his eyes off Catherine. "I'm just trying to understand who exactly we're dealing with." His smile turned predatory. "Because if my suspicions are correct, we may have stumbled onto something far more valuable than a bison bull." Catherine remained silent, calculating. The revelation that Maxwell might know or suspect her true identity changed everything. This was no longer about a stolen animal or wounded pride. If word spread about who she had been, everything she and Joshua had built would crumble. There were still bounties on the verdict's head in 3 states, not for crimes committed, but for embarrassing the men who'd failed to recruit or control her. More importantly, there were old enemies who would cross mountains to find her. "If they knew she was alive, you've got quite an imagination, Mr. Maxwell," she finally said. "But I'm just a widow trying to survive." "We'll see." Maxwell gestured with his pistol. "On your feet. We're going to have a longer conversation somewhere more private. Then you'll tell me exactly who you are and where you've hidden your money." The verdict wouldn't have walked away empty-handed. As Catherine slowly rose, a sound outside caught their attention, the distinctive metallic rack of a shotgun being prepared to fire. "That's far enough, gentlemen." A new voice, authoritative and calm, came from beyond the open door. "Lower your weapons and step away from Mrs. Blackwell." Sheriff Harlan stood silhouetted in the doorway, the twin barrels of his shotgun unwavering. The light from the moon caught the silver star on his chest, making it gleam against his dark coat. Maxwell's face twisted in fury and surprise. "This doesn't concern you, Sheriff. Private dispute. Breaking into a widow's home in the dead of night seems mighty public to me." Harlan's weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes were hard. "Weapons down. Now." For a tense moment, Catherine thought Maxwell might risk it, but survival. Instinct won out. He slowly lowered his pistol. Ridley, however, was slower to comply. His eyes darted between the sheriff and Catherine, the lantern light catching the burn scars on his face, making them appear deeper, more sinister. "Ridley," Maxwell warned, reading his companion's intent. "Don't." "Too late." Ridley swung his weapon toward Harlan. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, the sheriff's shotgun and Catherine's silver Colt. Ridley crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Maxwell dropped his own weapon entirely, hands raised high. "Didn't have to end this way," Harlan said grimly, keeping his shotgun trained on Maxwell. "Mrs. Blackwell, are you all right?" Catherine nodded, lowering her revolver. "I am now, Sheriff. Thank you for your timely arrival." "Thank your Bison," Harlan replied with the ghost of a smile. "Spotted him wandering loose near the road. Figured something must be wrong for you to leave your barn door unlatched." In the commotion, Titan must have pushed through the door she'd secured less firmly than usual. Catherine's eyes stung unexpectedly. The very animal Maxwell had come to steal had inadvertently saved her. As Harlan secured Maxwell with handcuffs, the outlaw's eyes remained fixed on Catherine, calculation and suspicion evident in his gaze. "This isn't over," he murmured as the sheriff led him past her. "I know who you are, and once word spreads—" "That's enough out of you." Harlan cut him off, giving him a none-too-gentle shove toward the door. Catherine watched them go, Maxwell's threat echoing in her mind. 20 years of careful obscurity shattered in a single night. As the echoes of hoofbeats faded into the distance, she stood alone in her cabin, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, leaving her drained but clear-headed. She returned to the bedroom and, once again, retrieved the cedar box from beneath the floorboards. The silver Colt gleamed in the lamplight, its engravings telling a story few would believe. The story of a woman who had brought law to the lawless with cunning and iron will. The verdict had been many things: ruthless, calculating, feared, but never naive. Maxwell was right about one thing: this wasn't over. Once word spread of his suspicions, others would come. Men seeking old bounties, former rivals seeking revenge, treasure hunters seeking the fortune the verdict was rumored to have accumulated. The peaceful life she had built with Joshua, the quiet existence she had maintained after his death, all of it balanced now on the fragile thread of a secret 2 decades old. Catherine closed the box, but didn't return it to its hiding place. Instead, she began gathering essentials: food, ammunition, clothing. By dawn, she would need to be gone, at least temporarily. She needed information, needed to know how much Maxwell actually knew and who he might have already told. Most of all, she needed to contact the only people who might still be loyal to the verdict after all these years. As she worked, Catherine's movements became more fluid, more purposeful. The careful facade of Catherine Blackwell, respectable widow, gradually fell away, revealing glimpses of the woman she had once been. The woman who had commanded dozens of loyal bounty hunters, outsmarted the finest marshals of two nations, and built a legend in the untamed West. The verdict was awakening, and God help anyone who threatened what was hers. The dawn painted Redemption Valley in shades of crimson and gold as Catherine Blackwell rode away from the only home she'd known. For 20 years, Titan plodded steadily behind her, tethered to Catherine's aging paint mare. She hadn't bothered trying to sell the homestead or secure her few possessions. Some things mattered more than others when your past came hunting. Sheriff Harlan had locked up James Maxwell on charges of breaking and entering, attempted murder and conspiracy, enough to hold him for at least a few days. But iron bars wouldn't contain the suspicions Maxwell had voiced. Words had a way of slipping through, finding ears hungry for gossip or opportunity. The verdict had a $2,000 bounty on her head in Wyoming Territory alone. Dead or alive. 3 words that had followed her like shadows even after she'd hung up her duster. As the sun climbed higher, Catherine turned her mare south toward Whispering Creek, a nondescript waterway that marked the unofficial boundary between settlements and the true wilderness of the Montana Territory. She knew this route by heart, though she hadn't traveled it in decades. Some paths remain etched in memory, no matter how one tries to forget. By midday, she reached a weathered hunting cabin, nestled in a stand of lodgepole pines. The structure seemed abandoned, its roof partially collapsed, windows long since shattered by storms or vandals. Catherine dismounted, her legs stiff from hours in the saddle. Another reminder that she was no longer the young woman who had once ridden for days without rest. She secured the animals and approached the cabin cautiously, hand resting on the silver colt. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, groaning as she pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light penetrating the damaged roof. The cabin appeared empty except for a broken table and the remnants of a cast-iron stove. Catherine moved to the back wall, counting boards from the corner. When she reached the 5th plank, she knelt and pressed firmly on its lower edge. The board pivoted smoothly, revealing a hidden compartment. "At least some things remain dependable," she murmured, reaching inside. Her fingers found a small oilskin package. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a tarnished silver badge on a leather cord, its surface etched with the word "Justice" above an engraved scales. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper, the creases so deep they had nearly split the material. Catherine studied the badge, memories flooding back. She had commissioned one for each of her top lieutenants, a symbol of their private authority when official law failed or corrupted. "Never thought I'd wear this again," she said to the empty room, slipping the cord around her neck and tucking the badge beneath her shirt. She unfolded the paper, a hand-drawn map marked with locations only. She and her inner circle would recognize landmarks that wouldn't appear on any official chart, meeting points established long ago for emergencies such as this. The nearest was less than a day's ride away, a natural rock formation locals called the Sentinel. Whether anyone would still honor the old protocols after 20 years remained to be seen. But Catherine had few alternatives. If word of the verdict's resurrection was spreading, she needed intelligence, resources, and possibly protection, none of which Catherine Blackwell, respectable widow, could access. But the verdict could. She replaced the loose board and left the cabin, continuing south. As she rode, Catherine's posture gradually changed, her back straightening, chin lifting, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, noting details most would miss. Disturbed brush suggesting recent passage, the flight patterns of birds indicating whether other riders might be nearby. These weren't conscious actions. They were the ingrained habits of someone who had survived in a world where inattention meant death. By late afternoon, she spotted the distinctive rock formation rising from the landscape, a natural spire resembling a watchful sentinel standing 50 feet tall amid the rolling foothills. Catherine approached cautiously, tethering her horse and Titan in a sheltered gully before climbing a ridge that offered a clear view of the formation. For an hour, she watched, ensuring no ambush awaited. Then, taking the silver badge from beneath her shirt, she positioned herself where the setting sun would catch the metal, sending brief flashes of light visible for miles. An old signal, one her people would recognize if any still lived, if any still watched, if any still considered themselves hers. As darkness settled over the land, Catherine made a small camp in the gully, positioning herself to see anyone approaching while remaining hidden. She allowed herself only the briefest of fires to heat coffee, then extinguished it completely. The night was bitter cold, but she'd endured worse. Sleep came in fragments, her body remembering how to rest while remaining alert to danger near. Midnight, she woke fully, hand already on her revolver, senses straining to identify what had disturbed her. A soft whistle carried through the darkness, 3 notes rising in pitch, then 2 descending. No natural bird would produce that precise pattern. Catherine remained motionless, waiting. The signal came again, closer now. She replied with a single low whistle. The response only the verdict would know. Minutes later, a shadow detached itself from the greater darkness. A man moved with careful deliberation down the slope toward her position, his silhouette familiar despite the passing years. "Never thought I'd see that signal again," he said, his voice carrying the rough texture of decades spent in harsh conditions. "Figured you to be long dead, Catherine." "Hello, Isaiah," she replied, keeping her voice neutral, though seeing him stirred conflicting feelings. "It's been a long time." Isaiah Cooper had been her second in command, her most trusted lieutenant, a man who had killed for her, bled for her, would have died for her, until she disappeared, leaving him and the others to fend for themselves. When the operation crumbled without her guidance, he crouched several yards away, still cautious. In the faint moonlight, she could make out the changes 20 years had wrought, silver streaking his once coal-black hair, deep lines etched around his eyes, a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jawline that hadn't been there. "Before? Need to see it," he said flatly. Catherine reached slowly into her shirt and withdrew the badge, letting it catch what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Isaiah nodded once, then reached into his own collar, producing an identical talisman. "Still carry it. Some habits die hard, some loyalties too." A bark of laughter escaped him, though there was little humor in the sound. "Loyalty? Is that what you call it after all this time?" "Fair enough." She gestured to the space beside her. "Join me anyway, for old time's sake." After a moment's hesitation, Isaiah settled himself cross-legged on the ground, maintaining a careful distance. 20 years, Catherine, not a word. Most figured territorial justice finally caught up with you. Others thought you'd taken your cut and run east, maybe back. To Boston or New York. It's a long story. I've got time. His tone made it clear he expected an explanation. Catherine studied him in the darkness, weighing how much to reveal. Trust had to be earned anew. Too much had happened. Too many years had passed. "Joshua Blackwell," she began, watching for his reaction. Isaiah's face hardened instantly. "The ranger, one who infiltrated that gang down near the Idaho border. Claimed to be a horse trader from Kansas." "The same." Catherine kept her voice neutral. "He was sent to bring me in, preferably alive, dead if necessary. You disappeared. So did he." Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "Always wondered about that timing." "Caught me," Catherine admitted, surprising herself with her candor. Had me dead to rights, could have collected the bounty, made marshal on the reward alone. But he didn't. It wasn't a question. No. The memories surfaced with surprising clarity. Joshua, revolver aimed at her heart, his blue eyes troubled as he listened to her explain why she'd built her operation, how she'd protected innocent settlers when territorial law couldn't or wouldn't, the code of honor she enforced even among bounty hunters. He made a different choice, Catherine continued. Offered me a deal, walk away from the operation, from the life, start fresh somewhere far from the territories. In exchange, he'd report me dead, killed in a shootout. No one would come looking. And you agreed? Disbelief colored Isaiah's voice. Just like that, abandoned everything you built, everyone who depended on you. The accusation stung, though she'd anticipated it. You all had your shares, enough to start new lives if you chose. Money wasn't the point, Catherine. Isaiah's voice lowered. We were a family, the only one many of us ever truly had. I know, she acknowledged, the weight of her decision still heavy after all these years. I made a choice I thought necessary at the time. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past settling between them. Why did you really agree to his terms? Isaiah finally asked. The Catherine I knew would have put a bullet in that Ranger and disappeared across the Canadian border. Catherine considered the question, one she'd asked herself many times over the years. I was tired, she admitted. Tired of running. Tired of violence. The frontier was changing, railroads pushing through, telegraph lines connecting towns that once took weeks to reach, proper lawmen replacing frontier justice. What we did, what I built, was becoming obsolete. So you surrendered. I survived, she countered, adapted, found a different life. Isaiah made a non-committal sound. And the Ranger, Blackwell, what happened to him in this new life of yours? I married him, Catherine delivered the statement plainly, watching Isaiah's reaction. His surprise was evident even in the darkness. You married the man sent to hunt you down? Stockholm Syndrome, Catherine. The sarcasm in his voice cut deep. She laughed softly despite herself. Nothing so dramatic. We traveled together after leaving the territories. Weeks on the trail, just the two of us. Came to an understanding. He saw more in me than just the verdict. I saw more in him than just a ranger. Touching, Isaiah commented, making no effort to hide his bitterness. And now, Catherine asked, changing the subject, what became of Isaiah Cooper, the verdict's right hand? His expression shifted, something like pride replacing the resentment. I did all right. Got a place north of Promise Creek. Legitimate cattle operation. Small, but it's mine. Even got myself elected county commissioner last year. Commissioner Cooper. She couldn't hide her surprise. Politics? You always said politicians were just thieves who hadn't been caught yet. Takes one to know one, Isaiah replied, a ghost of his old humor surfacing. Figured if I couldn't beat them, might as well join them. Do some good from the inside. Catherine nodded, genuinely impressed. And the others? What happened to them after I left? Isaiah's expression sobered. Miguel died in a shootout with cattle rustlers up near the Canadian line. Esther married a shopkeeper in Idaho Falls, has grandchildren now. Franklin's a sheriff down in Wyoming, if you can believe it. The names brought faces to Catherine's mind, people who had ridden with her, trusted her, followed her into danger countless times. The knowledge of their fates, particularly those who had died, settled like stones in her chest. And Hannah? She asked quietly, thinking of the young woman who had joined their operation after the verdict saved her from a lynch mob. Hannah had been barely 20 then, fierce and loyal to a fault. A shadow crossed Isaiah's face. Don't ask about Hannah. Isaiah, I said don't. His tone left no room for argument. Some wounds don't heal, Catherine. Some betrayals cut too deep. She absorbed the rebuke, understanding there were consequences to her actions she might never fully comprehend. After a moment, she redirected the conversation. "I need information, Isaiah. A man named James Maxwell recognized me, or suspects at least. Knew things about the verdict that only someone connected would know." Isaiah frowned. "Maxwell? Tall fellow, fancy dresser, talks like he had schooling back east." "You know him?" "Of him," Isaiah clarified, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "Works for Victor Holloway these days. Holloway Mining Company." "Holloway," Catherine repeated, the name triggering alarms in her memory. "Sebastian Holloway's son?" "The same." Sebastian Holloway had been a mining magnate whose operations in Colorado had been notorious for their brutal treatment of workers. The verdict's operation had once brought in 3 of Holloway's enforcers, men wanted for murdering striking miners. The elder Holloway had sworn vengeance, put a private bounty on the verdict's head that rivaled anything the territorial authorities offered. And now his son is operating in Montana, Catherine mused, with men who recognized the verdict on sight. Victor's. "Cut from the same cloth as his father," Isaiah confirmed grimly. "Worse, maybe. Sebastian at least had a code of sorts. Victor's got nothing but greed, and a mean streak wide as the Missouri." "What does he want here?" "Montana's mining boom ended years ago. Not gold or silver. Coal and land. He's buying up every distressed property he can find, especially since this winter pushed so many farmers to the brink." Catherine's mind raced. "Including properties around Redemption Valley?" Isaiah nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Your homestead sits on the edge of a coal seam that runs through half the valley. Worthless when you settled there, but with the railroad pushing north." "Suddenly very valuable," Catherine finished. "And a lone widow struggling after a hard winter makes an easy target, especially if that widow could be pressured by threats of exposing her former identity," Isaiah added. "Maxwell wasn't after your bison, he was after your land." The pieces aligned with disturbing clarity. Maxwell hadn't recognized Catherine by chance. He'd been sent specifically to investigate her, to find leverage that would force her to sell her homestead to Holloway. "He'll try again," Isaiah warned. "Once he gets out of jail, if he gets out of jail, he'll come with more men next time. And if word about who you really are starts spreading—" "I need allies," Catherine concluded. "People I can trust." Isaiah studied her for a long moment. "What makes you think I'd help you after you abandoned us?" "Because you answered the signal," she replied simply. "Because you kept the badge. Because whatever happened 20 years ago, we were family once." He looked away, his profile harsh in the faint moonlight. "I can give you information about Holloway's operation, maybe even shelter for a few days. Beyond that—" He left the offer unfinished. It was more than Catherine had hoped for. "Thank you, Isaiah." "Don't thank me yet," he cautioned, rising stiffly to his feet. "I've got a place about 5 miles west of here, safe enough for the night at least. We can talk more about Holloway and what he's planning for Redemption Valley." As they gathered their horses and prepared to depart, Isaiah asked the question she'd been waiting for. "The ranger, Joshua, what happened to him?" "Pneumonia last winter," Catherine replied, the grief still raw despite the passing months. 3 days of fever, and he was gone. Isaiah nodded, a gesture that conveyed understanding, without sympathy. "And now you're alone, facing enemies old and new." "Not entirely alone," Catherine responded, glancing at him. "Not anymore." Isaiah didn't reply, but as they rode west through the bitter Montana night, Catherine felt something shift between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of a path toward it. After 20 years of solitude, it was a start. What neither of them noticed was the distant figure watching from a ridge half a mile back, the moonlight glinting briefly off the brass barrel of a spyglass as it tracked their departure. I still can't believe that's Titan, Isaiah muttered, watching the massive bison devour hay in the small corral behind his ranch house. Last time I saw him, he was a scraggly calf you rescued from that flash flood near Bear Creek. Catherine leaned against the fence post, allowing herself a rare smile. Stubborn even then, nearly kicked my ribs in when I pulled him from the water, and now he's the last of your herd. There was no mockery in Isaiah's voice, just a quiet understanding of what the animal represented, survival against impossible odds, a living reminder of better days. The Cooper Ranch sprawled across 200 acres of prime grassland, modest by Montana standards, but impressive for a man who'd started with nothing but bounty money and determination. The main house was solid timber, the barn and outbuildings well maintained, everything speaking of careful stewardship and hard-earned prosperity. "You've done well for yourself," Catherine observed, genuine respect in her tone. Isaiah shrugged, though she could see the flicker of pride in his weathered face. "Just following what you taught us. Invest in land, build something that lasts, though I doubt you expected me to go legitimate." "You always were the smartest of my lieutenants," he snorted, smart enough to know when the game was changing. Comfortable silence fell between them, the tentative reconciliation of the previous night, evolving into something approaching their old camaraderie. Dawn had broken clear and cold over the mountains, bringing with it a day that promised both clarity and challenge. "We should talk about Holloway," Isaiah said finally, guiding her toward the ranch house. "And about Maxwell's escape." Catherine's head snapped up. "Escape? When?" "Yesterday morning." Isaiah held the door open for her. "News came by telegraph to Promise Creek while you were still sleeping. Sheriff Harlan found dead in his cell, Maxwell gone, 2 deputies wounded." The news shouldn't have surprised her, yet Catherine felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Maxwell wasn't just a hired gun. He was a man with pride and resources, exactly the kind of enemy who wouldn't stop until he'd achieved his objective or died trying. Inside, the ranch house revealed an unexpected side of Isaiah's character. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on law, history, and territorial politics. Maps covered another, each marked with notes about property boundaries and land values. A small desk in the corner held stacks of official-looking documents bearing the territorial seal. "Commissioner Cooper indeed," Catherine murmured, taking in the transformation of her once wild lieutenant into a man of standing and influence. Isaiah gestured toward the kitchen table where coffee steamed in 2 mugs. As they sat, he unfolded a map of Redemption Valley and the surrounding territory. "Holloway's been buying land systematically," he explained, indicating properties marked in red. "Started 2 years ago with small claims on the valley's eastern edge. Now he controls almost 1/3 of the viable farmland. For coal mining," Catherine clarified. "That's what everyone assumes, but I'm not convinced." Isaiah tapped a section where the markings clustered densely. "These properties don't align with the known coal seams, and Holloway's been paying above market value, double in some cases. That's not how coal barons operate." "Exactly." Isaiah's expression was grim. "Something bigger is at play. The railroad's new northern spur is scheduled to break ground in spring. 3 possible routes are under consideration, all of them passing through or near Redemption Valley." Catherine saw the implications immediately. Control enough land along the right-of-way, and you control where the railroad builds. And suddenly, property worth pennies an acre becomes worth dollars or more. Isaiah nodded. "The territorial governor makes the final decision on the route next month, based on recommendations from a commission. Let me guess, you're on that commission." A wry smile crossed Isaiah's face. "Chairman, in fact. Which is why Holloway's men started making visits to my ranch last month. Friendly suggestions about which route would best serve the territory's interests, backed by less friendly implications. If you disagreed," Catherine finished, Holloway doesn't like being refused, Isaiah confirmed. Last week my foreman was beaten half to death in Promise Creek. No witnesses, of course. 2 days later, my best breeding bull was found with its throat cut. The pattern was familiar. Escalating intimidation designed to break resistance, without leaving evidence that could be traced back to its source. It was a tactic Catherine had encountered many times during her years as the verdict, usually employed by powerful men who considered themselves above the law. And now Maxwell shows up at my homestead, conveniently recognizing the verdict beneath. Catherine Blackwell's widow's weeds. She frowned, connecting threads that suddenly seemed too precisely aligned. Isaiah, how much does Holloway know about my past? The hesitation before he answered told her everything. Victor Holloway arrived in Montana 3 years ago. Within 6 months he'd hired half a dozen researchers from back east, men who specialize in digging through old records, finding connections most would miss. Looking for what? At first, I thought it was just standard business intelligence, learning who owned what property, who held influence, who could be bought or pressured. Isaiah's expression darkened. But one of my sources in Promise Creek said they were particularly interested in old bounty notices, territorial court records, specifically cases associated with the verdict's operation. The realization hit Catherine with physical force. Sebastian Holloway's vendetta, the son is finishing what the father started, with resources the father never had, Isaiah added grimly. Victor inherited the family fortune, connections in Washington, friends in every territorial government, and he's smarter, patient, methodical. He doesn't just want revenge, he wants to build an empire on your downfall. By exposing me as the verdict, that would just be the beginning. With the bounty still active, he could have you arrested, tried for crimes the statute of limitations hasn't expired on. Your property would be forfeit, along with any claim to protection under the law. Catherine's mind raced through implications. But why go to such lengths for one small homestead? Because your property is the key to controlling the valley. Isaiah pointed to a section on the map where her land was marked. Your 160 acres sit directly between 2 sections Holloway already owns. With your parcel, he'd control the only viable passage for the Northern Railroad route, the route I've been advocating as the most economically beneficial for the territory. So he either forces me to sell or exposes me as the verdict and takes the land when I'm imprisoned or dead. Catherine's voice was steady despite the cold certainty settling in her chest. Either way, he gets what he wants, and the commission approves his preferred route, multiplying his investment tenfold. Isaiah finished grimly. They sat in silence. For a moment, the magnitude of their opposition coming into focus. Victor Holloway wasn't just a wealthy businessman with a grudge. He was a calculating predator with political connections, hired guns, and the patience to orchestrate a years-long campaign to achieve his objectives. "We need more information," Catherine finally said. "About Maxwell's whereabouts, Holloway's, next moves, who else he might have told about my identity." Isaiah nodded. "I have a contact in Promise Creek, telegraph operator who owes me a favor. If Maxwell's communicating with Holloway, messages will pass through her office." "When's the commission's final vote on the railroad route?" 3 weeks. From tomorrow, the governor makes his decision within days after that. Catherine absorbed this information, mentally calculating timelines. "So we have less than a month to counter whatever Holloway has planned." "We?" Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were running." "I did that once already," she replied, holding his gaze. "Didn't work out so well for either of us." The corner of Isaiah's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "What did you have in mind?" Before Catherine could answer, hoofbeats sounded outside, a single rider approaching at speed. Isaiah was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man who'd never truly forgotten his former life. "One of my ranch hands," he reported, tension easing from his shoulders. Riding hard, though. They met the young cowboy on the porch as he dismounted, his horse lathered from exertion despite the cold. "Commissioner," he gasped, barely sparing a glance for Catherine. "Trouble in Promise Creek. Sheriff's office says there's a group of men asking about you. Armed, not looking friendly." "Holloway's men," the hand nodded, led by some fancy-dressed fellow with a scar across his cheek. "Sheriff told them you were away on county business, but they're drinking at the Golden Spur, offering money for information on your whereabouts." "Maxwell." Catherine and Isaiah exchanged glances, understanding passing between them without words. "How many?" Isaiah asked. "6 that Wade saw, all armed, riding good horses." Isaiah turned to Catherine. "We should prepare, if they don't find me. In town, this ranch is the logical next stop." Catherine was already calculating. 6 men against the 2 of them, possibly more if Maxwell had split his forces. The ranch offered defensive positions, but also civilian ranch hands who could be caught in the crossfire. "We need to draw them away from here," she decided. "Away from your people." Isaiah's brow furrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "Maxwell wants the verdict. Let's give him what he wants, just not how he expects it." An hour later, Catherine sat astride her mare atop a ridge overlooking the main road from Promise Creek, the silver badge displayed prominently against her dark coat. Isaiah had objected to her plan initially, arguing that she was delivering herself directly into Maxwell's hands. But Catherine recognized the opportunity for what it was. A chance to seize initiative, to dictate the terms of engagement rather than merely reacting to Holloway's moves. The plan was simple, but risky. Catherine would make herself visible, enough to draw Maxwell's attention, leading him and his men away from the ranch and into terrain where she and Isaiah could control the confrontation. Not to kill, Catherine had no desire to add more blood to her ledger, but to capture Maxwell alive, secure evidence of Holloway's schemes, and potentially turn the tables on their adversary. Isaiah had ridden ahead to prepare the ambush. Point, a narrow canyon where Catherine had once trapped a gang of horse thieves nearly 25 years earlier. Some tactical advantages never changed, regardless of how many years passed. The distant sound of hoofbeats brought Catherine to full alert. She remained motionless, watching as riders appeared on the road below, Maxwell in the lead, 5 men behind him, exactly as reported. They rode with purpose but without urgency, men confident in their mission and their superiority. Catherine waited until they were close enough to distinguish faces before she moved, guiding her mare to a position where the winter sunlight would catch her badge, creating a momentary flash visible to the riders below. Then she turned and rode unhurriedly toward the canyon, never looking back but knowing with absolute certainty that Maxwell had spotted her. The shout behind her confirmed it. "There, on the ridge!" Catherine maintained her measured pace, a deliberate taunt to men accustomed to prey that fled in panic. She could hear them spurring their horses up the slope, Maxwell's voice carrying clearly as he issued commands. "Take her alive! Holloway wants her undamaged!" So Victor Holloway was indeed pulling the strings, just as they'd suspected. Catherine filed away this confirmation as she crested the ridge and descended toward the canyon, now allowing her mare to pick up speed, fast enough to maintain distance, slow enough to ensure pursuit. The entrance to the canyon loomed ahead, a narrow passage between towering walls of striated rock. Catherine glanced over her shoulder for the first time, noting the distance between herself and her pursuers, close enough to maintain their interest, far enough that stray bullets wouldn't find their mark. She entered the canyon at a gallop, counting silently as she passed landmarks Isaiah would recognize. A lightning-struck pine, a boulder shaped like a bear's head, a small stream crossing. At the third marker, she veered sharply left into a concealed cutout in the canyon wall, a space just large enough for horse and rider to disappear from the main path. Seconds later, Maxwell and his men thundered past, unaware that their quarry was no longer ahead of them. Catherine waited until the last rider passed before emerging, now behind her pursuers, and fired a single shot into the air. The riders wheeled in confusion, suddenly finding their prey had become the hunter. Before they could reorganize, Isaiah emerged from his hiding place on the canyon's rim, rifle aimed at the clustered men below. "That's far enough, gentlemen," Catherine called, her voice carrying the same commanding tone that had once made her the most respected and feared bounty hunter in the territories. "Lower your weapons and dismount." Maxwell's face contorted with fury as he recognized the trap, but rather than surrender, he drew his pistol with shocking speed, firing at Catherine even as his men scattered for cover. The bullet whistled past her ear as she ducked, returning fire with the precision that had once been her trademark. She aimed not to kill, but to disable, her shot catching Maxwell's right shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. "Next one goes through. Your heart," she warned, the silver Colt steady in her hand. Isaiah's rifle barked from above, the bullet striking the ground at the feet of a rider who'd been raising his weapon. "I wouldn't," Isaiah advised calmly. "The lady's being polite. I'm not feeling nearly so generous." For a tense moment, the standoff held. Catherine at one end of the canyon, Isaiah above, Maxwell and his 5 men caught between. Then, with deliberate slowness, Maxwell raised his left hand in surrender, his right arm hanging useless at his side. "You're making a mistake, Verdict," he said, using the name as a weapon. "Victor Holloway doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. You think you've won something here, but you've just signed your death warrant." "Perhaps," Catherine acknowledged, maintaining her aim as Isaiah descended to join her. "Or perhaps I've finally stopped running from ghosts. Dismount, all of you. Toss your weapons aside." As the men complied, Catherine studied Maxwell, seeing beyond his anger to the calculation beneath. This man was dangerous, not just because he was willing to kill, but because he was intelligent enough to serve a master like Holloway effectively. Such men didn't surrender easily, nor did they abandon their objectives because of a single setback. "What now?" Isaiah murmured as they secured their prisoners. "The Promise Creek jail won't hold them for long, not with Holloway's influence." Catherine had already considered this problem. "We don't need to hold them long, just long enough to send a message to Holloway." What kind of message? She met Maxwell's glare with cool determination. That the verdict isn't just a legend from the past. That Catherine Blackwell isn't alone or defenseless, and that some forces, once set in motion, can't be controlled even by men with money and power. Isaiah studied her face, recognizing the strategy taking shape. "You're not planning to run. You're planning to confront Holloway directly." "Not confront," Catherine corrected. "Hunt, the way I should have hunted his father when I had the chance." She turned to Maxwell, whose defiant expression had faltered slightly at her words. "You're going to help us, Mr. Maxwell, voluntarily or otherwise." "I'll die before I betray Holloway," Maxwell spat. Catherine smiled, a cold expression that hadn't crossed her face in 20 years. "No one's talking about betrayal. I'm talking about delivery. You're going to carry my terms to your employer, and if you're smart, you'll convince him to accept them." As they secured the prisoners for transport to Promise Creek, Catherine felt a familiar sensation settling over her, the focused clarity that had once made her the most effective dispenser of frontier justice the territories had ever known. The verdict hadn't just been a bounty hunter. She had been the embodiment of consequences, the living reminder that no man, no matter how wealthy or powerful, stood above accountability. Victor Holloway was about to learn that lesson firsthand, and if he chose to reject it, he would discover why his father had once placed a small fortune on the verdict's head. Not out of justice, but out of fear. The hunter was fully awake now, and the hunt had just begun. Promise Creek had changed since Catherine last walked its streets 20 years earlier. The rough-hewn mining camp had evolved into a proper frontier town, with false-fronted businesses lining the main thoroughfare, a brick courthouse dominating the town square, and electric telegraph wires strung between newly erected poles. Progress had reached even this remote corner of Montana territory, bringing with it both civilization's comforts and its complications. Catherine moved through the town with practiced anonymity, her dark clothing unremarkable among the winter attire of local residents. The silver badge remained hidden beneath her coat, its weight a constant reminder of her purpose. Isaiah had insisted on escorting Maxwell and his captured men to the new sheriff himself, allowing Catherine to pursue a different objective in town without drawing unnecessary attention. The Promise Creek telegraph office occupied a narrow storefront between the mercantile and a lawyer's office. A bell tinkled softly as Catherine entered, finding the interior unexpectedly warm and well-appointed. Behind the counter, a woman in her 40s looked up from her ledger, pushing wire-rimmed spectacles higher on her nose. "Good afternoon. How may I assist you?" Her tone was professional but not unfriendly. "I need to send an urgent message," Catherine replied, placing a folded note on the counter. "To Victor Holloway at the Helena Grand Hotel." The telegrapher's expression remained neutral, though Catherine noted the slightest hesitation before she reached for the paper. "Certainly. That will be 75 cents for the first 10 words, 5 cents for each additional word." Catherine counted out the coins while the woman unfolded the message. As she read, her eyes widened almost imperceptibly before her professional mask reasserted itself. "Maxwell captured. The verdict sends regards. Meeting requested. Terms negotiable. Respond via bearer." "Rather terse," the telegrapher commented, her fingers already moving to the telegraph key. "The recipient will understand," Catherine assured her. She studied the woman more carefully, noting details that might have escaped less experienced eyes. The quality of her clothing, too fine for a telegrapher's salary. The gold wedding band that didn't match the worn silver engagement ring beside it. The nervous glance toward the back room when Holloway's name was mentioned. As the telegrapher tapped out the message, Catherine made a decision. "You're Mrs. Laverty. I believe Isaiah Cooper spoke highly of you." The woman's fingers faltered momentarily on the key before resuming their rhythm. "Commissioner Cooper is a valued customer." Her voice remained neutral, but a new wariness had entered her eyes. "And a friend, I'm told. One who appreciates your discretion regarding certain messages that pass through your office." Mrs. Laverty completed the transmission before responding. "I maintain the confidentiality of all communications as regulations require." "Of course." Catherine leaned forward slightly. "But I wonder if that same confidentiality extends to messages sent by Victor Holloway or his associates over the past week. Messages that might concern Commissioner Cooper or perhaps a woman named Catherine Blackwell." The telegrapher's posture stiffened, her hand drifting toward a drawer beneath the counter. "I don't know what you're implying, but I suggest you leave before you reach for the derringer in that drawer," Catherine finished calmly. "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Laverty. I'm not here to threaten you. Quite the opposite." "Who are you?" The woman's voice had dropped to a whisper, though they were alone in the office. Catherine considered her options carefully before responding. Truth, she had learned long ago, could be more effective than deception when deployed strategically. "I'm the woman Holloway has been hunting, the one his telegrams have been discussing, and I believe you know more about his plans than you've shared with Isaiah Cooper." Mrs. Laverty's face paled slightly, confirmation enough of Catherine's suspicion. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Catherine kept her voice gentle but firm. "And I think you have your reasons for keeping certain information to yourself. Perhaps financial pressures, a loved one in trouble. Holloway is adept at finding leverage. The telegrapher's composure cracked, revealing momentary anguish before she mastered herself again. You know nothing about my situation. I know the signs of someone operating under duress, Catherine replied. I spent years recognizing such patterns. Tell me, Mrs. Laverty, what does Holloway hold over you that would make you betray Isaiah Cooper, a man who considers you a friend? For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint clicking of the telegraph receiving incoming messages. Finally, Mrs. Laverty reached into the drawer, but instead of a weapon, she withdrew a folded letter. My son, she said, her voice barely audible. 23 years old, working for the railroad in Helena. Holloway's men caught him gambling, accused him of cheating. They were going to kill him. She pushed the letter across the counter. Holloway offered an alternative. My son lives, works in his mining office now, sends me part of his wages. In exchange, you provide information about telegrams passing through Promise Creek, Catherine finished, understanding the impossible choice the woman had faced. And you alert Holloway to anything concerning certain individuals. Mrs. Laverty nodded, shame and defiance mingling in her expression. I didn't tell him everything. When Commissioner Cooper's messages mentioned you, I edited what I reported, said the information was unclear. Small mercies, Catherine acknowledged, respecting the woman's attempt to minimize the damage while protecting her son. But Holloway knows I'm in the area now. Yes. Mrs. Laverty straightened, seeming relieved to have the truth exposed at last. And he's coming personally to deal with the situation. That's what yesterday's telegram said. This was unexpected. Holloway leaving his comfortable position in Helena to handle matters directly suggested either supreme confidence or unusual urgency. Catherine suspected the latter. With the Railroad Commission's vote approaching, and his carefully orchestrated plans suddenly threatened, Holloway couldn't afford to rely solely on intermediaries like Maxwell. When does he arrive? Tomorrow's afternoon train. Mrs. Laverty hesitated before adding, he's not coming alone. The message mentioned specialized personnel accompanying him. Bounty hunters, most likely, or private detectives with expertise in tracking fugitives. Catherine absorbed this information, recalculating her strategy. She had hoped to use Maxwell as leverage, forcing a negotiation on more favorable terms. Holloway's imminent arrival accelerated the timeline dangerously. What will you do now? Mrs. Laverty asked, studying Catherine with new interest. If I'm reading Holloway's messages correctly, he has evidence of your previous identity, enough to have you arrested. Perhaps. Catherine considered her next words carefully. But evidence works both ways, and Holloway's methods of acquiring property might not withstand close scrutiny either. The telegraph key clattered suddenly, both women turning toward it as Mrs. Laverty instinctively moved to receive the incoming message. Her eyes widened as she transcribed it. It's for you, she said, sliding the paper toward Catherine. Holloway's response. Meeting accepted. Blackwell Homestead, sunrise tomorrow, come alone, or Cooper pays the price. Catherine felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. Cooper pays the price? What does that mean? Mrs. Laverty's expression was grave. The telegraph from Helena came with a second message from Promise Creek. Commissioner Cooper never arrived at the sheriff's office with Maxwell and his men. They were ambushed on the South Road. How many? Catherine demanded, striding through the door of Dr. Morrison's surgery at the edge of town. The smell of carbolic acid and blood hung heavy in the small waiting room. The young ranch hand who'd brought news of the ambush stood as she entered, his hat clutched in blood-stained hands. 4 men hit us about 2 miles south of town, came out of nowhere. Commissioner Cooper took a bullet in the side before I could even clear my rifle. Is he alive? The doctor emerged from the back room before the hand could answer, wiping his hands on a stained cloth. "He's alive," the older man confirmed, his expression guarded. "Bullet missed vital organs, but he's lost blood. Won't be riding anywhere for a few days at minimum." "I need to see him," Catherine said, already moving toward the treatment room. "He's sedated," the doctor warned, but made no move to stop her. Isaiah lay on a narrow examination table, his complexion ashen beneath his weathered tan, bandages visible beneath a blanket covering his torso. His breathing was shallow but steady, his face relaxed in unconsciousness. Catherine studied him silently, cataloguing his condition while her mind raced through implications. "What happened to Maxwell and the other prisoners?" she asked the ranch. "And who had followed her in?" "Taken," he replied grimly. "The ambushers were focused on freeing them, not killing us outright. Could have finished Commissioner Cooper but didn't, almost like they wanted him alive but incapacitated." Another piece of Holloway's strategy falling into place. With Isaiah wounded and unable to attend the Railroad Commission meeting, the balance of power would shift. If Holloway controlled enough votes among the remaining commissioners, he could secure approval for his preferred route, regardless of Isaiah's objections. Catherine placed a hand briefly on Isaiah's shoulder before turning to leave. "Keep him safe," she instructed the doctor, "and tell no one he's here." Outside, twilight was settling over Promise Creek, gas lamps flickering to life along the main street. Catherine walked purposefully toward the livery stable, her mind assembled fragments into a coherent picture. Holloway was accelerating his endgame, arriving personally, neutralizing Isaiah, demanding a meeting at Catherine's homestead rather than a neutral location. The message was clear. He believed he held all the advantages and was positioning for a final confrontation on his terms. But Catherine had spent 2 decades as the verdict before becoming Catherine Blackwell. She recognized the pattern of a man, overreaching, mistaking momentary tactical advantage for strategic victory, and she had no intention of meeting Holloway on his terms. At the livery, she retrieved her mare and settled her account with the stable master. As she tightened the cinch on her saddle, a voice spoke from the shadows of an empty stall. "Riding out alone seems unwise, given the circumstances." Catherine's hand moved to her revolver before she recognized the speaker. A tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair, dressed in men's clothing with a distinctive beaded vest. The years had changed her face, adding lines around her eyes and mouth, but the intensity of her gaze remained unmistakable. "Hannah," Catherine breathed, genuine. Surprise breaking through her composure. "Isaiah said you were gone? Dead? Depends who's asking." Hannah Moonfeather stepped fully into the lantern light, her expression unreadable. "Been tracking you since you left Cooper's ranch. Wasn't sure it was really you until I saw that signal by the Sentinel." Catherine studied her former lieutenant carefully. Hannah had been the youngest member of her inner circle, a half-Blackfoot woman with unmatched tracking skills who had joined the verdict's operation after being saved from a wrongful hanging. She had also been the most devoted to their cause, and potentially the most deeply betrayed by Catherine's disappearance. "Isaiah wouldn't speak of you," Catherine said neutrally. "Said some wounds don't heal." A mirthless smile crossed Hannah's face. "Isaiah protects those he cares for, even from painful truths." She adjusted the rifle slung across her back. "He didn't want you to know I spent 2 years searching for you after you vanished. Didn't want you to know I was captured by territorial authorities because I refused to believe the verdict was truly gone." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavier than any shouted recrimination. Catherine accepted it without defense. "How long were you imprisoned?" 3 years. Would have been more if Franklin hadn't arranged my release when he became sheriff." Hannah's gaze was steady, evaluating. "I didn't come here for apologies, verdict." "Why did you come?" "Because Holloway's men have surrounded your homestead since yesterday," Hannah replied matter-of-factly. 4 on the North Ridge, 3 by. The creek, 2 more in your barn. They're expecting you to walk into a trap tomorrow." Catherine absorbed this information, reassessing her already forming plan. "And you know this because? Because I've been watching them watch for you." Holloway's hired the Pinkerton agency, not their official operatives, but men who trained with them before being dismissed for excessive methods. Hannah's lips curved in a slight smile. "They're good, but they don't know the land. Don't know how to move in Montana winter without leaving sign a child could follow." "While you do," Catherine acknowledged, remembering how Hannah could track prey across seemingly impossible terrain. "What's your interest in this fight, Hannah? Last I knew, you'd sworn to bring me to justice if you ever found me alive." "That was before I learned the full story from Franklin," Hannah replied. "About the ranger, about the choice you made." She shrugged. "Besides, Holloway represents everything we once fought against, men who believe power places them above consequences." Catherine considered her options carefully. Hannah's expertise would be invaluable, particularly with Isaiah incapacitated. But trust, once broken, wasn't easily reconstructed. "I'm not walking into Holloway's trap," she finally said. "I'm setting one of my own, but I need to reach my homestead without his men detecting me." Hannah nodded, understanding immediately. "There's a game trail along the eastern ridge. Difficult passage in daylight, nearly impossible in darkness, unless you know it intimately." "Which you do." "Which we both do," Hannah corrected. "You showed it to me 23 years ago when we tracked the Carson brothers after they murdered. That settlement family said it was your secret path home." The memory surfaced with surprising clarity. A brutal manhunt, 3 killers cornered in a box canyon, Hannah's unwavering support during Catherine's single moment of doubt. They had used that hidden trail afterward, returning to the verdicts. Temporary headquarters beneath a full moon, much like the one now rising over Promise Creek. "We have a 5-hour ride ahead," Catherine decided, assuming the trail is still passable. "It is. I checked it 2 days ago." Hannah led her own horse from an adjacent stall, already saddled and provisioned. Her preparation spoke volumes about her confidence that Catherine would accept her offer of assistance. As they rode out of Promise Creek, Catherine found herself reassessing the day's reversals. Isaiah wounded, Maxwell freed, Holloway closing in, developments that should have placed her at a severe disadvantage. Yet the reappearance of Hannah Moonfeather, with her unparalleled wilderness skills and intimate knowledge of the verdict's methods, unexpectedly balanced the scales. "Holloway believes he's hunting a solitary widow," Catherine observed as they left the town lights behind. "A ghost from the past who's been living quietly for 20 years. Hannah glanced sideways at her former leader, and Instead, he's facing the verdict's resurrection," Catherine replied, her voice hardening with resolve. "Not just me, but what I represented. Justice beyond the reach of wealthy men's influence. The promise that no one, regardless of power or position, escapes accountability for their actions." They rode in silence for several miles, the moonlight illuminating the snow-covered landscape in ethereal blue-white radiance. Finally, Hannah spoke again, voicing the question that surely troubled her. "What happens after Holloway? If you survive this confrontation, does the verdict continue? Or does Catherine Blackwell return to her quiet life?" It was the same question Catherine had been asking herself since Maxwell first appeared at her homestead. 2 identities, 2 lives, each with its own integrity and purpose. The peaceful existence she had built with Joshua had genuine value, represented a different kind of strength than the legend of the verdict. Yet in the days since emerging from retirement, she had rediscovered aspects of herself long suppressed. The tactical clarity, the unwavering resolve, the capacity to inspire both loyalty and fear. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "For 20 years, I believed those lives were mutually exclusive, that to become Catherine Blackwell meant burying the verdict Completely. Hannah nodded, understanding evident in her expression. And now? Catherine considered the question as they approached the hidden trail that would lead them to her homestead and to the confrontation with Holloway that would determine her future. Now I'm beginning to wonder if they were ever truly separate at all. Pre-dawn darkness shrouded the Blackwell homestead in frozen stillness. Catherine studied the property from the sheltered vantage point of a pine-covered knoll 300 yards east of the cabin. Just as Hannah had reported, Holloway's men had positioned themselves strategically, shadows against shadows, waiting for an approach that would never come. They've got clear sightlines to all obvious approaches. Hannah whispered beside her, breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. But not to the root cellar entrance, Catherine nodded. The underground storage space had been Joshua's idea, built during their first year at the homestead. A narrow tunnel connected it to the cabin's main floor, an escape route inspired by his years chasing fugitives who always seemed to have one last avenue of retreat. Catherine had humored him then, considering it an unnecessary precaution. Now it would prove their salvation. "We'll need a distraction," she murmured, studying the positions of the watchers through her field glasses. "Something to draw their attention away from the cabin while we move into position." Hannah's smile was barely visible in the darkness. Already arranged. On cue, a series of sharp cracks echoed from the northern ridge, followed by the distinctive whinnying of frightened horses. Holloway's men, stationed in that direction, scrambled to their feet, weapons drawn, attention diverted from the homestead. "Titan," Catherine realized, recognizing the distinctive bellow that followed. "You brought my Bison here?" "Had help," Hannah acknowledged. "Franklin arrived from Wyoming yesterday afternoon. He's creating quite a convincing impression of cattle rustlers hitting the North Ridge." Catherine absorbed this unexpected development. Franklin Davis, once her 4th lieutenant, now a Wyoming sheriff, had crossed territorial lines to join this confrontation. Another piece of her past returning when needed most. "We move now," Hannah urged, already sliding down the slope toward the concealed entrance to the root cellar, her movements fluid and nearly silent despite the snow. Catherine followed, years of muscle memory guiding her approach. They reached the cellar entrance without incident, Hannah keeping watch while Catherine cleared snow from the half-hidden doors. The padlock yielded to the key she'd kept on her chain these 20 years, the hinges mercifully silent thanks to Joshua's meticulous maintenance. Minutes later they emerged through the trapdoor into Catherine's cabin, finding it cold and undisturbed since her hasty departure days earlier. Hannah immediately positioned herself at a window, watching for any sign their entrance had been detected, while Catherine took stock of the situation. "How many men with Holloway himself?" she asked quietly. "4 arrived on yesterday's afternoon stage," Hannah replied without turning. "Maxwell makes 5 plus the 9 already watching the property. 14 total, not counting Holloway. Difficult odds, even for the verdict in her prime. Impossible for Catherine Blackwell alone. But she wasn't alone anymore. Franklin has 3 deputies with him," Hannah continued, anticipating her next question. "All former bounty hunters who rode with us. They're creating the diversion on the ridge, then will circle around to cover the eastern approach, which leaves the western side exposed," Catherine noted. Hannah's mouth curved in a rare smile. "Unless someone happens to be covering it." Understanding dawned. "You've been planning this for days." "Since I first got word you were alive," Hannah confirmed. "Some loyalties run deeper than disappointment," verdict. Before Catherine could respond, movement outside caught her attention. A carriage approached along the main road from Promise Creek, its black, lacquered surface gleaming in the first light of dawn. 4 riders flanked it, with Maxwell immediately recognizable among them, despite his bandaged shoulder. "Right on time," Catherine observed, adjusting her position to remain hidden while maintaining a clear view. "Let's see what kind of man Victor Holloway really is." The carriage halted 50 yards from the cabin. After a moment, the door swung open, and a figure emerged, tall, impeccably dressed in a fur-lined coat, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. Even at this distance, Catherine could see the family resemblance to Sebastian Holloway. Though the son lacked the father's imposing physical presence, Victor's power came from calculation rather than intimidation. "Mrs. Blackwell," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I know you're watching. I've come as agreed to discuss terms." Catherine remained silent, observing as Holloway gestured to his men. They spread out in a semicircle behind him, rifles ready but not yet aimed directly at the cabin. "I admire your caution," Holloway continued after receiving no response. 20 years of successful anonymity suggests a prudent nature. But circumstances have changed. I believe we can reach an accommodation beneficial to both parties. Strange words from a man who sent armed thugs to threaten a widow. Catherine called. "Back," her voice seemingly coming from the cabin's far side, though she hadn't moved. Hannah glanced at her approvingly, the old ventriloquism trick still effective after all these years. Holloway turned toward the voice, his expression revealing nothing. "A regrettable misunderstanding. Maxwell exceeded his instructions." Did he exceed instructions when he murdered Sheriff Harlan? When he ambushed Commissioner Cooper? The accusations rang across the yard, deliberately pitched to carry to Holloway's men. Let them understand exactly whom they served. A flash of annoyance crossed Holloway's face before his mask of civility returned. "Unfortunate incidents in pursuit of legitimate business interests. I've come to offer compensation for these inconveniences. What's your offer?" Catherine kept him talking, aware that Franklin and his deputies would be moving into position, gradually tightening the circle around Holloway's forces. $50,000 for your property," Holloway replied without hesitation. "Far above market value. You can relocate anywhere you wish, with no further interference from me or my associates. And my identity, the evidence you've gathered about the verdict." Holloway smiled thinly. "Consigned to flames upon completion of our transaction. Your secret remains safe." The offer was precisely what Catherine had expected. Substantial money and promised protection contingent on her immediate disappearance. The same pattern Holloway had used with other landowners, though with the added leverage of her hidden past. "And if I refuse," she called, still concealing her true position, "then I'm afraid matters become rather more complicated." Holloway's tone hardened slightly. "The territorial authorities would be fascinated to learn that the notorious verdict has been living quietly in their jurisdiction all these years. The bounties remain active, as I'm sure you're aware." Catherine exchanged glances with Hannah, who held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, silently counting down. The moment had come. "I have a counter-offer, Mr. Holloway," Catherine announced, stepping into view at the cabin's front door, her silver badge gleaming prominently on her chest, silver Colt held openly but aimed at the ground. "One that concerns consequences rather than compensation." Holloway's eyes widened momentarily before narrowing in calculation. He gestured subtly to Maxwell, who began moving his hand toward his holstered pistol. "I wouldn't," came a stern voice from the tree line to their right. Franklin Davis stepped into view, Winchester leveled at Maxwell's chest, his sheriff's badge catching the morning light. "Not unless you're eager to join Sheriff Harlan." Almost simultaneously, 3 more figures emerged from concealed positions. Around the property, Franklin's deputies, each with weapons trained on Holloway's men. The balance of power shifted visibly, confusion spreading among the hired guns as they realized their supposedly foolproof ambush had been compromised. "What is this?" Holloway demanded, his composure cracking slightly. "Justice," Catherine replied simply, descending the cabin steps. "For Sheriff Harlan, for Isaiah Cooper, for every homesteader you've threatened or defrauded." "You have no proof of any wrongdoing," Holloway sputtered, though his confident demeanor had faltered. "These accusations are baseless." "Perhaps in a traditional court," Catherine acknowledged, continuing her steady approach. "But we're not in Helena now, Mr. Holloway. We're in Redemption Valley, where justice sometimes requires alternative methods." Hannah appeared on the cabin roof, rifle aimed with deadly precision. From the western approach, more riders became visible. Not Holloway's reinforcements, but weathered men and women Catherine recognized despite the passing years. Former members of the verdict's operation, summoned by some silent call that had spread through their scattered ranks. "Your men have two choices," Catherine announced, her voice carrying the absolute authority that had once made the verdict a name whispered. In fear and respect. "Surrender their weapons, or face the consequences of their allegiance to a man who murders lawmen and threatens widows." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of Holloway's hired guns slowly lowered his rifle, followed by another, then a third. Only Maxwell maintained his defiant stance, hand still hovering near his weapon. "Maxwell," Holloway hissed, "do something!" Whether the command was for Maxwell to fight or surrender remained unclear. The gunman hesitated, assessing the increasingly hopeless situation before slowly raising his hands. "Smart decision," Franklin commented, moving forward to secure Maxwell's weapon. "Sheriff Harlan's deputy is particularly eager to discuss your jailbreak." Holloway's face had drained of color as he watched his carefully orchestrated plan collapse. "This changes nothing," he insisted, though his voice had lost its commanding edge. "I have connections in Helena, in Washington. You can't touch me." "I'm not interested in touching you," Catherine replied, stopping a few paces from him. "I'm interested in ruining you. Every telegraph operator between here and Helena has received documentation of your methods, the threats, the coercion, the murders committed in your name. Mrs. Laverty was particularly thorough in collecting your communications." "You're bluffing," Holloway whispered, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "The territorial governor received a special package this morning," she continued inexorably, "containing sworn affidavits from landowners you've intimidated, along with banking records showing bribes paid to 2 railroad commissioners. Even in Montana, such evidence has consequences." Hannah joined Catherine, additional papers in hand. "We also took the liberty of sending copies to 3 major newspapers. They're quite interested in the story of how Sebastian Holloway's son attempted to manipulate the Railroad Commission through violence and intimidation." Holloway's arrogance finally shattered completely. "You can't do this. Your father learned the cost of targeting the verdict," Catherine interrupted. "A lesson you should have heeded." Around them, the remaining hired guns were being disarmed by Franklin's deputies and the gathered former bounty hunters. The confrontation had ended not with gunfire, but with the systematic dismantling of Holloway's power, exactly as Catherine had planned. "What happens now?" Holloway asked, his voice hollow with defeat. Catherine studied him thoughtfully. In his desperation, she saw echoes of his father, the same entitled rage, the same inability to comprehend that some forces couldn't be bought or threatened into submission. "Now you leave Montana Territory," she stated flatly. "You abandon your claims to land in Redemption Valley. You forget you ever heard the names Catherine Blackwell or the verdict. And you live with the knowledge that your reputation and business interests will never recover from what we've revealed." "And if I refuse?" Catherine smiled, a cold expression that had once made hardened outlaws surrender without resistance. "Then Sheriff Davis would be delighted to charge you as an accessory to Sheriff Harlan's murder. I understand Wyoming justice is particularly swift and uncompromising these days." Franklin nodded solemnly, the threat clear in his steady gaze. Holloway looked from face to face, searching for any sign of weakness or hesitation. Finding none, his shoulders slumped in final acknowledgement of his defeat. "I'll leave," he conceded, bitterly. "But this isn't over." "For you it is," Catherine replied with absolute finality. "Some verdicts can't be appealed." As Franklin and his deputies led Holloway and Maxwell away, Catherine turned to survey her homestead. The rising sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard, illuminating both the weathered cabin she had built with Joshua and the gathering of former bounty hunters who had answered the call when needed most. The verdict had returned, not as a solitary hunter, but as the center of a network that spanned territories and transcended time. Yet Catherine Blackwell remained as well, the woman who had built this home, who had loved a ranger enough to begin anew, who had found dignity in quiet perseverance. For 20 years, she had believed these identities irreconcilable. Now, standing on the threshold between her past and her future, Catherine understood the truth that had eluded her for so long. They had always been two aspects of the same unbreakable spirit. Spring arrived in Redemption Valley with unusual gentleness, the harsh winter surrendering to new growth across the greening landscape. Catherine sat on her newly rebuilt porch, watching Titan graze contentedly among a small herd of young bison, a gift from a rancher in Wyoming who had once been a fugitive Catherine had cleared of false charges. The animals moved with unhurried purpose, their massive frames casting long shadows in the evening light. 3 months had passed since Holloway's defeat, each day bringing small but meaningful changes to the valley and to Catherine herself. The Railroad Commission, with Isaiah Cooper recovered and firmly at its helm, had approved the northern route through the valley, one that respected existing homesteads while still providing the essential connection to distant markets. Holloway Mining Company had dissolved, its Montana holdings sold at auction to cover legal penalties. Victor Holloway himself had retreated east, his reputation in ruins, his father's vendetta finally laid to rest. "Tea's ready," Hannah called, emerging from the cabin with 2 steaming cups. Since the confrontation, she had stayed on at the homestead, her presence no longer surprising to Catherine, who had come to appreciate the quiet companionship of someone who understood both her past and present. "Thank you." Catherine accepted the cup, breathing in the fragrant steam. "Any word from Promise Creek?" Hannah nodded, settling into the adjacent chair. "Telegraph from Isaiah. The last of the disputed. Land deeds have been resolved. Homesteaders are keeping their properties, with compensation for those who suffered losses during Holloway's campaign." "And the bounties?" This question remained Catherine's most pressing concern, though she asked it with less apprehension than before. Officially rescinded as of yesterday, Hannah's smile carried genuine warmth. Franklin's petition to the territorial governor was successful. The verdict's record has been adjusted to reflect services to justice rather than offenses against it. Catherine absorbed this news, the weight of decades lifting from her shoulders. No more looking over her shoulder, no more fear that a chance encounter might expose her. Past, no more maintaining the rigid separation between Catherine Blackwell and the verdict. "Strange," she murmured, "to be pardoned for crimes I committed while enforcing the law that couldn't protect those who needed it most." "Not so strange," came a familiar voice from the edge of the yard. Isaiah Cooper dismounted from his horse, moving with only slight stiffness from his healing wound. "The law finally caught up to what you understood years ago, that justice is more than words on paper. It's action in the face of wrongdoing." Catherine rose to greet him, noting the official document case he carried. "You rode all this way to deliver this news personally. Some messages deserve more than telegraph wires," Isaiah replied, joining them on the porch. He opened the case, withdrawing an ornate document bearing the territorial seal. Governor's full pardon and commendation. There's more. The railroad is offering to purchase a right-of-way through the eastern edge of your property. Fair price, minimal disruption. I'll consider it, Catherine said, though her mind was already assessing the advantages such a connection would bring to her growing bison herd. There's talk in Helena, Isaiah continued, accepting the cup of tea Hannah offered, about establishing a more formalized territorial marshal service. Professionals with the authority to cross county lines, pursue fugitives wherever they flee. Catherine raised an eyebrow. And you're telling me this because they're looking for someone to train these marshals, someone who understands both sides of the law, someone who built the most effective fugitive recovery operation the territories had ever seen. The proposition hung in the air between them, unexpected yet somehow fitting. After 2 decades of hiding her expertise, Catherine was being asked to share it officially, to shape a new generation of lawmen who would carry forward what she had begun. I have a homestead to manage, she observed, though without firm rejection. And Titan would miss me. Hannah and Isaiah exchanged knowing glances. The position requires only 3 months in Helena, Isaiah clarified. The rest could be managed. From here, the railroad would make travel convenient once completed. Catherine gazed out over her land, considering the proposition. The past months had taught her that her 2 identities weren't warring halves, but complementary strengths. Catherine Blackwell's patience and perseverance balanced the verdict's decisive action and unyielding justice. Together, they formed something more powerful than either could be alone. What would Joshua think? She mused aloud, her question directed partly to herself. He'd be proud, Hannah answered without hesitation. He always said you were wasted on this homestead alone. Isaiah nodded agreement. He understood before any of us that your talents served justice, even when the law couldn't. As twilight deepened, across the valley, Catherine considered the path that had led her here. From feared bounty hunter to solitary widow to something new, something integrated and whole. The confrontation with Holloway had forced her to reclaim pieces of herself long suppressed. But in doing so, she had discovered that Catherine Blackwell wasn't merely a disguise the verdict had adopted. She was an authentic evolution, a natural growth from warrior to teacher. I'll need to expand the cabin, she decided, gesturing toward the bison herd. If I'm to train marshals here, we'll need proper accommodations, and I suspect Franklin will want to bring deputies for instruction as well. Isaiah's face broke into a rare, full smile. Already planning improvements? A woman in my position needs to look forward, Catherine replied, a matching smile softening her weathered features. The past has been settled. The future is what matters now. As darkness fell completely, lanterns were lit inside the cabin, their warm glow spilling onto the porch where the 3 former bounty hunters sat in companionable silence. From the barn came Titan's low, rumbling call, not distressed but contented, secure in his home and his growing family. Catherine touched the silver badge she still wore beneath her shirt, feeling its familiar weight against her heart. For 20 years she had hidden it away, believing it represented a life she had abandoned. Now she understood it had never been a symbol of who she had been, but of who she had always been, a woman who stood between the vulnerable and those who would prey upon them. A woman who understood that true justice required both strength and mercy. The verdict had never truly been dormant. She had merely been waiting, transforming, growing into something more complete. And now, as Catherine Blackwell gazed out over the land she had defended and the future she would help shape, she embraced the truth at last. Some legends don't fade with time, they evolve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.